Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Community and Youth Organizing January Speaker Series. My name is Sarah Zeller-Berkman, and I'm Director of Youth Studies Programs at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. So we have a BA now, an Advanced Certificate, and an MA in Youth Studies. For our MA, every year for the past few years, I think it's been 4 now, Lumumba, maybe 5, but we've been opening up a few of our sessions in a community and youth organizing course that we've been very lucky to have Professor Lumumba Bandele teach, but we've been opening up a few of the sessions to the field more broadly. And those sessions over the past few years have run the gamut, but we've had sessions on organizing around police brutality, kind of community organizing around self-determined education in the East, racial capitalism, to name a few. And tonight, we're really excited to set off our January speaker series this year in 2023 with this conversation about kind of the broader social political context in New York City in the 1990s and how that was impacting the community youth development work that was happening, but also how the deep and transformative community development work, community youth development work that was happening in the 90s was also kind of transforming the social fabric in our city. And so, the 90s was an incredibly vibrant and transformative time in the field of youth development and in that work. And, in my own life, it was kind of the late 90s and early 2000s that I came to be a youth worker in the field, and always heard about the incredible work of the Brotherhood Sister Soul and the ways in which they're doing deep local work in Washington Heights and also connecting young people to experiences across the world. In Brazil, we'll hear so much more about that. And then the work of the Valley and Majida's work, is just the model, right? And out of that spawned some of the most amazing first community development initiatives across the country, Beacons models that started in New York City in this period of time under Dinkins and Richard Murphy. And I personally learned so much from those youth development professionals. So as you can tell, I'm so excited. I'm so excited to dig into this and learn from our wonderful Professor Bandele and our speakers. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Professor, to introduce our speakers and get us started. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is always an honor to be in conversation with the folks at CUNY School of Professional Studies, the staff, the students, and the broader community. So thank you for joining us again this year. And Sarah, I'm actually not sure. It may be 4 years. I need to do some math and figure out. It may be around 4 years. But it's always an honor. Yeah, always an honor. And thank you all for making space for this. So today, like any other one, but this is particularly special because the two people that I will be in conversation with are extremely powerful individuals in their own right, but also very good friends that I've had the opportunity to build with. I've had the opportunity to create things with, create institutions with, contribute to amazing and powerful institutions with. And this is all really focusing on the backdrop of a particular time period in this city. And so we're going to dive in, and just so we are sort of grounded in what it is we're going to be doing, we're going to be engaging in conversation, really exploring the policies that supported many youth organizations of New York City in a particular era and explore where they are now. We're going to talk about how the landscape has shifted. We're going to look at valuable lessons that were learned and how that time has informed youth service provision today. And so, like I said, we are joined with two longtime youth service organizers and educators, joined by. And Majida Abdul-Karim, I'll start with, is a former staffer at the Valley Youth Agency, former principal of Benjamin Banneker High School. She's also the founder and principal consultant of Majida Abdul-Karim Educational Consultancy, LLC, and is an all-around amazing, powerful, and inspiring individual. Please welcome Majida Abdul-Karim to the discussion. And we are also joined by my good brother, Jason Warwin, who is the co-founder and associate director of the amazing and powerful Brotherhood Sister Soul. And side note, we are also co-founders of a small initiative that ended up growing beyond what we imagined, a childcare collective called Little Maroons. So Jason has always been building institutions, educational institutions, youth service institutions throughout his career. And so welcome the both of you, and I appreciate you all making time to be with us today. But before we get started, I'm going to hit y'all with a bunch of questions. We're going to engage in conversation, and we're going to sort of really have an informal conversation, like I said, like we in the living room kicking it. But before we do that, I want to just sort of create a picture of what we're talking about in terms of New York City in the 90s, right? What did the landscape look like? And not just in terms of the broader youth service, but what did New York City look like, right? And so one of the prevailing narratives we know is that this time was crime-filled and dangerous, but the reality was that the landscape included way much more, right? We know that we were experiencing in the that decade, the first Black mayor, David Dinkins, was elected into office, and he served from January 1990 to December of 93, right? We know that there were a lengthy list of young people of color that were killed by the NYPD. We experienced the Crown Heights uprising. We experienced the golden era of hip hop in its birthplace, right? We lost Tupac and Biggie. New York City welcomed Nelson Mandela. There were so many things that happened in this particular era. And part of what I wanted to do was really begin to sort of paint a picture, because what also was a part of this landscape was the vibrancy of young people during this time, right? There were a number of youth service agencies that allowed for young people to fulfill their potential, to imagine and actualize so many different realities. And there are a few that I'm gonna throw off the top of my head that I remember, and Majida and Jason, please chime in with other ones. Some that came off the top of Aspida, Crown Heights Youth Collective, Reedland Foundation, Alianza Dominicana, El Puente, The Valley, of course, Brotherhood, now Brotherhood Sister Soul. And there are a few others, but these were just only a handful of organizations that really helped to contribute to, again, this vibrancy, not only of New York City, but of particularly young people and families in the city. So let's start, if we can just start by sharing each of you individually how you got involved in youth service work. What was your introduction? So Majida, if we can start with you, welcome, and talk to us about how you got into this area.
Well, first of all, welcome to everybody here who's here in a large amount of people. So welcome, welcome. So for me, I was like that Saturday, always being in the program kind of kid, right? Tired of it, but always active, whether it was a STEM program at NYU, a rites of passage program, just always in something. My mom too was an educator and an activist. And she fought in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville fight for community control, which you know much about, Lumumba, in terms of what happened, in terms of community engagement and community members having a say in terms of curriculum and what administrators look like in certain communities where they should have been reflective of the students in which they service, and those massive fights with the UFT and a lot of Black educators being fired behind that. And then to go on to create independent institutions that they could have more control over. It changed the narrative in terms of community school districts and community control and community school boards. So I was kind of in the crux of all of that, so really didn't have a choice, right? But fell into doing some phenomenal work once I kind of got more so into college and around organizations. I was very familiar with the Caribbean Cultural Center, which is on 59th Street at that time. And my mother would take me there around 11 or 12, just so I can see the imaging of who you are in terms of a person of color in the diaspora. She would never allow me to call myself a minority because the majority of people around the world are people of color, and how cultured we were. So I was familiar with Caribbean Cultural Center. Then when I was in high school, a very prominent history teacher that I had mentioned a program that the Caribbean Cultural Center was sponsoring. I got involved in it because I was familiar with CCC. From that, my sister needed a job. She was in law school at the time during the summer. I met a sister who was active and worked with the Valley, also Forces of Nature, named Olamidele Husbands. Love her. Hey, Dele, shout out and ethos. And she was like, wait a minute, let me place a couple of calls. So it was actually me trying to get a job for my sister. My sister first was employed by the Valley. I was at Morgan State University after high school. Didn't like Baltimore, but I love everybody from Baltimore, no pun intended. Came back to the city, and then I needed a job because when I came back, my mother said, well, how you gonna pay for school? She refused. She was like, you gonna have to handle this. So I had to find a job, tap back into the resource that I found for my sister, and then I was employed by Manhattan Valley, and I was able to pay my tuition, but I was not ready for the level of exposure and development and level of engagement that I found there. Mind you, I'm from Brooklyn. So what was going on in Central Harlem was unbeknownst to me, right? So the 90s was a time of engagement, of training, of orientation, of standing in your purpose, whether you wanted to or not. In terms of the vibrancy, there were a lot of things going on. And in terms of the youth development that was going on, it was in response to a lot of the wrong that was going on, but it was also about cultivating our genius.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about what that cultivation looked like and consist of. So I appreciate that. Jason, can you share with us how you went from, being this young man that was involved in, some of this stuff to actually creating such an impactful youth service agency? How did you get into this work?
So, it's interesting. This is the first time I'm meeting Majida, but we have a similar trajectory in many ways. My start into all of this, began with family. My mother and my father were both involved, in the civil rights movement. My mother was actually campaigned and was the president of our local community school board 4. And so as I was growing up, campaign headquarters was my mom's living room. And there was a coalition of Black and Latinx and white folks who were organizing to try to create change in Community District 4 and to really create new alternatives and options for young people in our district. And I think, when we talk about that time period and the way it was different, when you have everyday citizens actively involved in policy setting for education, that creates, a different kind of culture within our communities, right? Folks are actively involved, local people, in how we're running the schools and in that electoral democratic process. And I saw that all around me when I was growing up. So that definitely had a huge influence on me. And I think, we were beneficiaries of the movements that came before us, right? We came out of that, Black Power movement was just before us. And so that generation of folks was all around us. And I had lots of mentors who were trying to point me in the right direction. And I got access to a number of different programs early on in my teenage years that just, solidified my desire to give back and to carry the torch forward. I think for a lot of our generation, they called us Generation X. It was kind of like, what's next, right? We saw the civil rights movement, we saw the Black Power movement. Now what's next? What's our contribution going to be? And I can just, I want to shout out 2 organizations in particular. One is the Encampment for Citizenship. When I was 16, I traveled to California, and the encampment, has been around since the 60s, but it happens in various parts of the country. They bring together young people from throughout the United States and sometimes internationally for 6 weeks during the summer to really study about social justice issues and to think about, ways to create change and to examine the history of social justice movements. So I went to that program when I was 16 years old and came back just like, all right, I'm ready. What are we going to do? And I started going to lots of different organizations, youth organizations around the city, and realized that a lot of these organizations that existed didn't know about each other, weren't in communication with each other, and basically got a bug to try to, network these organizations at that age. But I found my passion in it. I think, what we always want for young people is to figure out what your passion is, right? Find out what you're good at, what you love doing, and then pursue that as a career. And I feel fortunate that at a young age, I found that. And the other organization I just want to highlight is the International Youth Leadership Institute, IYLI. This was an organization that was started by, it wasn't even a formalized nonprofit at the time. It was just a program that two Black men decided they wanted to start to help Black and Latinx youth learn about international issues. And through this organization, and Susan Wilcox, who I know is on the board of SPS, who became the director of this organization and was one of my early mentors, took me on my first trip to Egypt. I went to Egypt for 4 weeks. I went to Senegal. I saw where our ancestors were taken from the motherland for 4 weeks. I was still in high school. And so once I, had those kinds of life-changing experiences, to come back home and think about, how do I now bring this experience to my people? And that's basically the trajectory that I've been on ever since. I'm just really appreciative of those elders who were inspired enough to think about, whether it was my parents and all the folks who were organizing around that, or it was other folks who were running these different organizations, Lumumba, that you labeled, who really saw, okay, how do we educate this next generation, not just in the academics, but in the history of struggle, so that they can be the leaders moving things forward. And I felt like I was surrounded by that in so many different ways.
I think another important sort of piece of the puzzle to add is that many of the people who created these particular agencies came out of the very historic movements of the 60s and 70s, right? So you have people who, like Luis Gardner Acosta, former member of the Young Lords Party, who founded El Puente. John Best was definitely a part of the educational movement, particularly in Harlem, but also throughout New York City, worked closely with my father. All of these folks really were continuing this, what we call this trajectory, right, of our liberation movement. And I want to put it in that context, because it really was not just about creating some like fun spaces for young people. It was really about building institutions that, as Majida said, we're going to be able to cultivate the best of who we were, of who we are, and who we could be, right? Mm-hmm. So, Jason, I'm going to ask you if you can just take it from where you left off, and what about all of those things made you create, along with Kari, Brotherhood? At that time, it was called Brotherhood.
Yeah. So fast forward, I went to Brown University. And so I came out of high school, Central Park East Secondary School in East Harlem. And, you talked about this in the beginning, what East Harlem was like in the 80s and 90s. Very, very tough situation. I'll just leave it at that. I mean, one of the things I talk to about, when I talk about to young folks now, is that we had, I think, in this past year, 435 murders, I think is what the official number is. In 1990, I think there were 2,200 murders, right? So you played Public Enemy at the start of this, one of my, hero music bands, the messaging at that time was fighting the power, right? And how do we do that? So I was getting this information from all over the place. But I really, when I got to college, what I was trying to figure out is, how do I take this education and use it in a way that is going to better my community? And one of the things that I found was that I was on college work study. I was getting money to work in the cafeteria and basically serve people food. But I found an organization within the campus that allowed you to use that college work study money to work in the community. And so basically I used college work study to start this program in a local community center in Providence, Rhode Island. And when I went to that community center, I essentially said I wanted to work with youth. That I knew that was the area that I was most interested in. They said, look, we got a bunch of guys who were just hanging out. They come in the gym, they play basketball here. We know they smoke weed out back. They're selling drugs in the parking lot. If you can create a program for these kids, then you can work here. And I went back home and put pen to paper, and that's where the whole idea of the Brotherhood got started. And we created essentially that, a brotherhood within the school. I was in a fraternity at the time, took some of those experiences I had in the fraternity, took a lot of my experiences that I had growing up, in high school in East Harlem, and put it together into a program that really was about helping young people to come together, to define for themselves what they believe in, and then to support each other in living up to those ideals. And that's always been the essence of what we do. We don't come in and tell young people, this is what it means to be a man, or this is what it means to be a woman, because I'm older and because I have more knowledge than you. It's more about helping them to define these things for themselves, helping them become critical thinkers, understand the issues that affect their lives, so that they can guide themselves in terms of overcoming those challenges, but then also be advocates for change to basically eliminate those challenges so they no longer exist within our communities. So we started doing this work with that group of boys. We did that there for a year and a half before we graduated. We recruited other Brown students to take the program over and to run it, Brown and Johnson and Wales, because we were a citywide organization at that time. And then Kari and I graduated from Brown University in '95, came back home and incorporated in New York City as the Brotherhood. And we started working in East Harlem and on the Lower East Side with schools creating brotherhoods. And we always had the vision of working with young women as well, but we were two Black men, you know, and this was the area and the focus that we felt we would be most successful with at the time. And it was really Susan Wilcox, you know, who was the chair of our board at the time. I had asked her to be the chair when we established the board of directors, who stepped down from being chair of the board and became the third co-director and spearheaded the effort to create Sister Soul. And so that was in our third year of existence. We went from being just the Brotherhood to being the Brotherhood Sister Soul, and we were creating rites of passage programs for young men and young women in different schools throughout the city. And we also established at that point our liberation program. And that was all about teaching the next generation of youth organizers and youth activists. And how do we take these kids and really help them to learn from the history of social justice movements in the past and be organizers and activists today. And, you know, we've grown organically since then over the years, so.
Right, and we want to talk about that growth in a minute, but shout out to Susan. I understand she's on the Zoom now as well. We love you, Susan. Majida, a lot of what Jason is talking about should sound familiar because some of those tactics were utilized by the founder of the Valley, John Best, in terms of creating young leaders, right? Can you talk a little bit about the Valley's basic function of cultivating new young leaders, but particularly around the leadership development component of its work?
Well, in terms of systems and structures that the Valley put in place, there were a lot of various departments, and every department had an adult, quote unquote, that was in charge of that department, and something that they enforced called a junior staff member. So every single department in the Valley, whether it was career development, leadership development, always had at least 1 to 2 junior staff members right there actively doing the work, so that if someone was not there, that junior staff member could always step it up. So that was, I think, a very important structure that they put in place. There was also something called Paul Robeson sessions took place on Wednesday. A lot of times it was the junior staff members that led Robesons and or a guest speaker that would come in. So whether or not you wanted to be a leader, John Best, may he sleep in power, forced you into leadership. Majida, come over here. I want you to speak to somebody. I really didn't feel like it, right? Very competent and capable, but sometimes you just don't want to exercise voice or be put on the spot. He always puts you on the spot. There was summer sessions that we did, racial harmony and violence reduction. Again, we're in the 90s. It was about 5 to 6 facilitators, all young people, teens and early 20s, that led those workshops, that helped to incept and inject their thoughts in terms of the curriculum. We were running our sessions like a major organization, right? Every time we saw cadres of young people, it can go from 50 to 100 people per day, Monday through Thursday. We would feed forward any information. We would pivot how we conducted our workshops. These were young people leading major initiatives and having a say in how things would go down at the Valley. John, even though he was like that manager in the early 50s, those R&B group, nope, do it right now, stop, drop, and roll. This is what it's looking like. He would listen to your voice because he was also a young person, and David Dinkins was his mentor, right? So he went in a full circle with the level of mentorship that he got, the level of youth development that he received, the insight and the brain trust, because he also allowed us to use our heads to critically think, like Jason said, to say, how will we systematize and change things? So it was definitely on the job training. And then as I've moved forward in my life, realizing I've already done this. I already know how to do this. And all of the impact in terms of what the Valley did informed when my practice when I was a young teacher. I was one of the youngest chapter leaders in New York City for the United Federation of Teachers, and felt totally comfortable, Black, Muslim, and female. And it was definitely an old boys club because I got that training from the Valley. Being a brain trust for district level new teacher development programs. Why? Because I knew how to think, speak, develop, and implement that training from the Valley as well. New York City Leadership Academy, the first cohort. Why? Because I had been doing that. And I can go on and on and on and on about that leadership marathon that continued to go on post my Valley days, because I had been trained very well to assume the position, though sometimes I did not want to, but I had the capacity to.
Right. You know, and I guess I should have stated from the onset, I'm also a former staffer at the Valley. And I wanted to just share that, you know, one of the things that John was I would say notoriously known for was just that, putting you on the spot. Like, you absolutely needed to be prepared for whatever came your way. So even if you didn't feel like it, like she said, you would actually have to be prepared. He would say often, particularly when we were going out to conferences or whatever, you need to be really clear about your purpose, why you are there. What are your top lines? If a mic is put in front of your face, what are you going to say? Right? Don't waste your time. Don't embarrass me. Right? Mm-hmm. But also preparation. Mm-hmm.
Can I just say something, Lumumba? And they were major mics, right? They were not little mics. Right. I remember being on panels with Dr. Cornel West and Dr. Marion Edelman Wright as a young person. And Cornel was looking at me like, you sister, you. And I'm like, okay, thank you. But, you know, just having that experience. Also, take our daughters to work. Gloria Steinem coming to the Valley and asking us as young women, we have this idea. What do you think about this? So the list goes on and on about those opportunities being placed in front of us, honoring our brain trust, and for people from vast audiences hearing our voice because of, you know, do it now, come on over, you're gonna be on this, okay, whatever you say, whether you want it to or not.
Mm-hmm. I wanna talk a little bit about that dynamic because, you know, we were all young people doing this work in our, most of us early 20s, right? Some of us may have been like late teens, but doing this work as young people, visibly young people, right? Talk a little bit about how that dynamic sort of helped you in terms of your youth service work, right? But also some of the challenges that came with that. The fact that you were not considered to be a complete adult, right? You're in this real weird space, right? But you also have a little bit more cultural alignment with some of the young people. So talk about some of those dynamics. And while you're doing so, I want to just sort of share a little bit of what we're talking about when we get a visual of what we mean when we say we weren't totally adults. So Jason, I'm gonna pivot to you as we highlight this photo of you, Kyrie, and Susan in this moment. First of all, when was this picture?
I don't think the picture's up right now.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Here we go. Okay.
Oh, okay. When was that picture? I'm assuming by my hairstyle that was probably around 97, 98, maybe. You know, to your question, when Kari and I started this work, yeah, we were 21 years old. When we first started this organization, I should say. I mean, I started youth organizing when I was in high school. You know, part of what we had to do was twofold. I mean, one, you know, at that point, you couldn't tell me anything. In other words, you know, I knew what I was trying to do for my people, and I didn't care, you know, whether or not you respected the fact that I was 21 years old at the time. I was driven, right? So I was on a mission. But what was important was that we had the backing, and by that I mean folks like Susan and folks who were on our board of directors who were of that older generation, who were also giving us the stamp of approval. by being on our board. And, back in those days, you had, I don't even see this much anymore, but you had your letterhead, and on your letterhead, you had all your board of directors on the side. Back then, you didn't send emails, you sent actual letters. And so when we would send an actual letter, it would be from Jason Warwin, but on the side would be all of these folks who were on our board at the time. And so I always felt that that opened the doors for us, right? That we had this stamp of approval. And we always felt, I knew as soon as I got in the door with somebody, I was going to be able to convince them of the efficacy of the work that I was doing, or if it was a funder, to give us some money, whatever it was. But yeah, that was one of the things that was really important in the day. I think a couple of things in terms of just the success of our organization. The other was that we were always working in teams, right? So, myself and Kari, the fact that there were two of us at the start that, were both equally driven, meant that, we could divide and conquer in terms of tasks. But we've always had a board of directors that was as equally invested. So Susan was on the board, but she was, like another staff person. And that exists to this day. Like folks having a broader base of folks who are actually all invested in the mission and, is what enabled us to be successful from the start, and to continue to be successful to this day.
Thank you. Majida, can you share a little bit about that also? Our dynamics at the Valley were extremely interesting. We had some really real relationships, both with the senior staff as well as with the young people. Let's talk about some of the ways that it actually was beneficial, and also some of the challenges of that.
Well, one thing that John did, he knew how to manage a culture of an organization. We were really like a family. We hung out together. We liked each other, right? And we too were very collaborative in terms of the different departments. I have an idea. What do you think about this? So as an adult, in terms of organizational building this kind of connectivity with staff, building a culture of creating family, of collaboration, of listening to voice, right? Of planning and creating together. And being very purposeful, as you spoke about before, in terms of what do you want your impact to be? That was very, very important. The other dynamic is, people came from all different walks of life at the Valley, right? People had some intense and very serious stories. So to hear about those things as a young person from another young person and how they're navigating their process was interesting and very jarring, right? The thing that I did learn from the Valley too, even though we were an organization that serviced a lot, if there was someone within the organization that needed the same service based on what they were going through, no matter where they came from, they got that, right? Carrying the Valley outside, we had this concept called one mic, one person speak at one time. So I thought I was going to bring that into the classroom. These kids like, what are you talking about? They were driving me crazy. We were very in circles so we can see each other. I set my classroom up the same way. These kids were talking, drive. I said, oh, no. Y'all are going in rows. We're going to change these things. So sometimes when you want to take a concept and put it in a different context, it will not work, right? You have to learn whom you're dealing with, and then pivot according to what your reality is at the moment. The other thing too, though, that I learned from the Valley and transcended into my work as an educator, you have to meet children where they are and provide them for what they need based on where they are. Be not judgmental, because you do have people that work with young people and they want very polished young people to come at the threshold. And if you're not meeting these preconceived notions and criteria of what excellence looks like, because you're in a gang or used to be in a gang, or you still have some street issues that you might need to deal with, I'm not dealing with you. We need to create a whole exorcism for that mindset, because if you're about service leadership and engagement with the community, you really need to be about that life in the vernacular of the streets.
That's right. That's right. And the thing is, if you're doing this work, you're going to come in contact, right? Unless you're doing what people are familiar with the term creaming, right? You're going to come in contact with these elements of young folks. And one of the things that the Valley had that I thought was one of its assets was DFERG. right? And so there was a brother who was in the basement of the Valley who had his own t-shirt printing press. And let me just say, it wasn't that he just had his own space and he was sort of renting. No. That was a part of the youth development work. The whole idea of recognizing the value of entrepreneurship, the whole idea of recognizing the communal resources we have at our disposal. And people were really, I think, proud to see that he was the designer of the work that Bad Boy, he did a Bad Boy logo, right, for Puffy and all of them, right? And so for young people to see that this was actually a viable kind of thing for them to do, but also that he represented another element. He wasn't like this sort of khaki suit wearing person who was trying to do youth service work. He was like, yo, I'm about making money. I'm about trying to, contribute to the community in a different kind of way, right? And so those kinds of things really help to pull together, I think, a broader picture as to what youth service provision could and should look like.
Lumumba, if I could just interject something here, because Majida talked about culture building in an organization. I'm just resonating with everything she was saying, but also something that for us has always been unique about our organization is that, and I think this is true of a lot of community-based organizations, but it's certainly true in terms of ours, is that this is more than a job.
That's right.
This is a mission, right? This is a way of life, right? If we weren't getting paid for this, we'd still be doing this. That this is about building our community. So we started out with 2 people. We now have 50 full-time staff, and the overwhelming majority of our frontline staff, full-time staff who are working directly with young people, are alumni of the organization. So these are youth who've gone through the program, went off to school, some of them, many of them, came back and are now paying it forward to this next generation. And the beauty is we've been doing it so long now, we've got, a second generation. So these, our oldest alumni now are in their 40s. And so they are, they've got their own teenage kids and who are coming through the program and things of that sort. But, one of the things that we've always had in place is that when you become a part of our organization, you become a part of our family. We called it the brotherhood because we are creating brotherhoods. And if that's for real, if you really have a commitment to a young person, that means, as she was saying, that they mess up, you're not just kicking them out the door. They're gonna mess up. That's part of youth development, right? It's about whether they pick themselves up and, are they willing to make amends for the things that they do? So we have a policy where, anything that goes on in a young person's life within our organization, we're gonna support them through it. Right. So that means if they need financial assistance, we've got a pool of money, emergency funds that we can support them with. If they need mental health services, we've got therapists on staff who can support them through that. If they're going to college, they need scholarship, we're going to, if they get arrested, we have a legal team. We have a pro bono legal team and we've got paid lawyers. We're going to make sure we cover you. So there's nothing that's going to go on in your life where we're going to be like, oh, sorry, we don't deal with that. It's like, no, you're part of our family now. We're going to operate like any strong family does. Whatever goes on in your life, we're going to be there for you. And that means that our staff are on duty 24/7. So we got their cell phone numbers, and that's part of the policy. And it also means that we're on 365. It doesn't stop. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that also when we're talking about youth development and we're talking about organizing and community building, that really what we have to do a lot of times is to create a vision of what life could look like, right? That we have a community that exists in a certain kind of way, and we know that, and a society and a government that works in a certain kind of way, and we know that it's messed up and it's wrong. So how do we create, to the best of our ability, an alternative to that so that young people can see there's a way out, right? There's another way of doing things. There's another way to communicate. There's another way to be together. And that's essentially what we're trying to do in our little corner of the world, is create an alternative. When kids walk in our building, become a part of our organization, they know they're loved, they know they're cared for, they know we got you not just for today, not just for this year, but moving throughout your life, right? You are now part of our community, and that's the way we're going to hold you as part of our family. So, just wanted to point that out, that is really critical, and making that shift from youth development or education to community building, family, love, using these terms to really articulate what it is we're doing so that we don't just seem another institution that's a part of the system, so to speak.
That's right. And that's a good segue, because I wanted us to talk about one of, I think, the most significant contributions of the Dinkins administration, particularly with respect to youth services, was the Beacon programs that were established, right? Majida, can you talk a little bit about what the concept was, how it existed, and then I know the Valley actually had and ran a Beacon program, but the way that communities in general benefited from this, and then it wasn't rocket science, quite honestly, but it was absolutely brilliant. It was profound and it was effective. Talk a little bit about the Beacon program, please.
Well, we know statistically, right, in terms of things that happen adversely to young people, they're usually after school. So it was a cadre of after-school programs injected into public schools to service the students that were in attendance there, looking at job readiness, college prep, recreational programs, training, youth development, just as a central core, and all these other branches that came from that. The Valley had several contracts with several schools. I know they were at MOK, they were at Watley, they were at 44, they were at Valley in the Alley, whatever that was. And the list
IS-10, right?
Right,
Yeah.
Valley in the Alley. Like, what's that? But
Brandeis.
Brandeis, yeah. It was so, and then the beauty of how it was used, folks were in these separate schools, but then there were opportunities for all of the students to come together at the Valley, right? So even though I wasn't at a school, I was at headquarters most of the time, and I see Kelly on the call. Shout out to my big sis, Kelly. Me and Rada work with Kelly. We came together often. We had bus rides and trips, and of course, opportunities for them to come to Robeson's, awards, completion of programs. I see you, I recognize you, you are part of us. So it was a great time, again, to solve a problem and develop young people, and some of those young people themselves got into youth services as well. So it was a phenomenal initiative.
And another component about that I thought was really powerful was that it serviced also other parts of the family. So it wasn't just young people. So like parents could come in and get assistance with like employment training, you know, and it was this idea that you cannot service just a young person directly and think you're going to transform their lives or the material conditions of their lives. You actually got to engage the family, right? There's no way you're going to just deal with this particular individual and think. So the idea of full family engagement was, I thought, extremely powerful. And then also utilizing the space of these schools that historically were just closed after 3 o'clock, right?
Makes
and so
no sense. Yeah.
Made no sense, right? You had the need, which where you had young folks that were out in the street, they were trying to just live their lives, be young folks, right? But you had these institutions, the space that had sports facilities, that had classrooms, that had all these things that auditoriums at large needed. It was not rocket science.
But there needs to be more research on it, because it created a serious, sustainable system.
Say it again.
Until today.
Say it again. Say it again. My theory, and Sarah knows this, I share this with her also, the next administration that came in took a claim for cleaning up New York City and saying that they made New York City safer. I'm specifically talking about Rudolph Giuliani. But really what we were looking at was the impact of 4 years of Beacon programs. What we're looking at was the manifestation of young people who actually now had employment, were engaging in different ways, families who had different services were getting some of their things met. And so that has an impact on safety. If you were with us 2 years ago, we talked about some of the dynamics of what made communities safe. These are those things. Meeting the immediate material needs of community makes community safer. And the Beacon programs, the one issue I had with it was like the infusion of about, I think it was 1,000 new cops, right? But they had all this other stuff that helped create safer communities. I'm sorry, Jason, go ahead, you were saying something.
No, I was just agreeing with you. I mean, it makes no sense that every school could be a community center.
Right.
We've got them in every single neighborhood. They should be open all weekend long. They should be providing all different kinds of services. It's a no-brainer. And today, there are these community schools. There are over 100 of them throughout the city, but they don't have the breadth of services that you're talking about in terms of the Beacon School movement there. But that could be an organizing effort that we could get around, because I think it just makes no sense that there aren't more services being provided outside of these schools that have, as you pointed out, all of these physical resources that could be utilized for the community, and bringing in staff to provide all the additional needs that the young people have and communities have.
Right.
And
Just
to
so folks
mention
know.
briefly- oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah.
No,
Please.
no, I was just gonna say, they developed another model in NYCHA facilities based off of beacons called Cornerstone. So now that I think there are almost as many beacons as there are cornerstones, but you know, based off of the beacon model.
Well, I want to
And-
ask you to talk a little bit more about cornerstones, because we want to, I wanted to tie the loop. Did cornerstones come out of that? Is it something that is different and new? And while we're preparing to do that, folks, we are going to, at 7 o'clock, take questions from you in the audience. We're going to ask you to put your questions in the chat. You can start loading up the questions if you want now, but we're going to be fielding questions from the chat. We're asking you to prepare those questions. Sorry, Sarah.
No, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the beacon started in 1991, 10, 40, 80 in New York, then went around the country. But then it was, I can't remember when the Cornerstone Initiative started in the city, but, you know, very clearly based off of a beacon model of community development, and really having people have access to these spaces and using the existing infrastructure in the city, and opening it up to community and having community determine what it is that should be done in those spaces. But I also do want to say that I think many people in the beacon movement felt like in other administrations, they really were, their hands were tied in different ways, because the way that the funding came down, it wasn't about serving 6 to 60-year-olds, which it was before. It was like just middle school youth. You only get paid for the number of middle school youth that you provide services to. And so Beacon folks, you know, really had to push back and fight and say, we need to get back to this other model where it was really allowing us to pivot based on our community's dreams, desires, needs, and, you know. Cool.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the concepts that both the Valley, some of the other agencies also not only lifted up, but also manifested through their work. And that was the international component of our connection with the world. You know, Valley, John was really, you know, persistent around having us to think internationally, but act locally. Like, what is our relationship to young people, not only in the other part of the boroughs, but what was our relationship to young people throughout the world, right? And so while we do this, I'm going to put up this particular photo of our esteemed panelist, Sister Majida, and I want you to share a little bit about what this particular photo was. What was the story behind this? Can you see it?
I can see it.
Okay.
I can see it. And one of our brothers in that photo is no longer here, Aaron Thomas, so may he sleep in power. So this was a international anti-apartheid movement conference post the recent release of Nelson Mandela in regards to some of the issues that were going to be faced in really transforming the country into independence with African leaders at the helm. So mind you, I'm a girl from Brooklyn. I was about 21 years old, and here I am. And wait, and I have to say this part too. So that's Walter Sisulu, one of the co-founders of the ANC, that I'm leaning over, smiling, so happy, like I'm here, y'all. And right next to him, looking at me, is Kenneth Kaunda. Now, Kenneth Kaunda was the first president of Zambia and a freedom fighter himself. When I was about 15 years old, I was in the Rites of Passage program, and we had to do an assignment entitled The African Leader That You Love, Appreciate, Honor the Most. And my essay was about Kenneth Kaunda, right? Fast forward to 1993, I'm sharing the dais with Kenneth Kaunda. and I tell him about this rites of passage program and what honor it is for me to be in his presence. And he said, sister, the honor is all mine. I could nearly fell out. But anyway, these are the opportunities that the Valley afforded us, that apartheid was not something specific to South Africa, because there was apartheid right in the streets of New York City, right? And to create those connections, but then not only to speak to apartheid in the streets of New York City, to be transported to the motherland to share the days with freedom fighters through the African National Congress, and to give agency to voice as a young person who was a part of this communal engagement, who was aware, and just to have that opportunity. Like, when does that ever happen, y'all? Rarely, but the Valley did that.
Right. And I'm just going to sort of circle at that particular narrative, and I want to pivot to you in a second, Jason, to talk about your work in Brazil. I see those of you with your hands up. I'm going to ask you to, again, please put your questions in the chat. We are going to engage in some Q&A shortly. But I think it was maybe 3 years before Majida had gone to South Africa. The Valley's first trip to South Africa was in '91, and I had the opportunity to attend this trip also. So that's me with the founder of the Valley, John Best, and the one and only Nelson Mandela. And a similar kind of situation where, you know, as a young person, as Jason talked about also, you know, a lot of my childhood was really grounded in doing anti-apartheid work. You know, we were on, as young people, lots of demonstrations and rallies calling for the release of Nelson Mandela. And this was my first time ever touching soil on the African continent. And as I'm coming off the plane, the first person to embrace us is Nelson Mandela, and says, "Welcome home, brother." So you can't imagine what that does to a young person who thinks they're committed to this work. And this, by the way, this photo is in his backyard in Soweto. All right. And so we were able to be in conversation, not only with Nelson Mandela, but what I thought was equally as powerful was other young people who were a part of the anti-apartheid struggle. And just so you know, in terms of context, 91 apartheid is still up. Outside of this house where we are, were the police, those tanks, right? And so this is still this particular time period. And so this was powerful. And what it does to young organizers is unbelievably impactful. Talk a little bit, if you can, Jason, about the work that you all are doing in Brazil. What made you consider taking your work into another continent?
Yeah, so just to connect though to you, I mean, I was in South Africa in '96. And so I mentioned in the beginning about traveling to Egypt and traveling to Senegal through the International Youth Leadership Institute. When we started our organization, that trip was so impactful. Those trips were so impactful for me. I knew that when I started my own organization, I wanted to provide that opportunity to young people as well, to travel to the motherland, to travel to the Americas. And so we partnered with IYLI, and we led, our first trip was to Morocco, which also included Spain. And then our second trip was to South Africa. And apartheid, I believe, ended in '95. So this was just after apartheid had ended, but you know, it was still very racially polarized, and, you know, communities like that. And actually Susan and I led that trip together. But yeah, as you're pointing out, you know, those kind of experiences not only expand our minds to the breadth of the world, right? When so much of youth development work is about helping young people to realize there's more than just what they see and what they know, right? To expand them to the broader world as a whole, but also to inspire, right? And I think, you know, going to South Africa in particular, and I also was an activist around the anti-apartheid movement in high school, that movement and the depth of commitment and the young people who were involved in that movement was an inspiration for, I think, our age group in the United States, because the youth in South Africa, as we all know, were at the forefront, as we've always been, or as they've always been, in movements throughout history. But, you know, being killed and being, you know, murdered and assassinated for their beliefs and their desire to be free. So we've always run since the early days an international study program. And so over the years now, we've been in Africa, we've been to South Africa, we've been to Ghana numerous times, we've been to Morocco, we've been to Egypt. And we bring kids for a month-long study program. They study about the country from January to June, so 6 months to study here. And then in July, they travel for 4 weeks. In the Americas, we've been to Cuba, we've been to Haiti, Dominican Republic, and we've been to Brazil numerous times. And the connection to Brazil, I mean, my wife is Brazilian. I lived in Brazil for many years. I lived there for 7 years, developed a lot of relationships in Bahia and in Rio de Janeiro. You know, our travels are really about connecting young people to their ancestry, to the African diaspora. And, you know, Brazil, as many people know, has one of the deepest and richest connections to Africa outside of the motherland, outside of the continent. And so there's a lot to learn there, a lot to experience there. And we actually established a branch of our organization while I was down there. So we actually have a group called Irmãos Unidos, which means Brothers United, that's in a small town in Bahia. And we've just over the years now, basically since, you know, around 2006, have had a strong presence and connection in Brazil and also Ghana, are two countries that we've gone back to numerous times over the years. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I think part of what we are underscoring, and I'm hoping that, well, two things. One, people are preparing questions because the floor is going to be yours in a minute. But I'm hoping folks are understanding the real significance and power of introducing young people to international forums, to international places, to travel, to be able to take them outside of the space that they are familiar with to a whole nother side of the world, and have them have the opportunity to see themselves and other people, to learn, and to be able to experience what their relationships are or could be to those kinds of things. Traveling is probably one of the most impactful educational experiences, particularly that young people can deal with. And I think that, you know, I want to encourage those of you that are participating in this discussion, who do youth service work, whether it be through education, whatever, to really, really try, if you can, make this happen. If not, consider doing this. This is powerful stuff, and it transforms lives, right?
One last focus on that, because I see Michelle is on here. I mean, Global Kids is an organization also that I've known since high school years, and they also do international study programs, and I've partnered with them in Brazil and other places on some of their international trips. But it's, as you said, transformational. And many of the kids who participate in our program, it's the first time out of the state, it's the first time out of the country, it's the first time on a plane, you know, it's the first time having a passport, you know, so it's, you know, transformational in terms of their worldview, but also then of their trajectory. Because once you get that travel bug, once you've done that, you know, then it's like you realize you want to go see other places. And also we know what how it opens doors for employment opportunities when you've said that you've traveled, and have those for college opportunities and things. If you put that on your college essay, things of that sort, it just opens doors in so many ways.
Absolutely. Correct, Susan. Travel is the best education, no question. So I want to ask y'all, as we pivot to make space for the question and answer, can you talk a little bit about how your experiences, both from participating in youth service organizations to running them, to building them, has impacted your current particular professional space right now? Majida, I know you went from working at the Valley, you know, being an intern at the Caribbean Cultural Center, working at the Valley, to being a principal, and now being a consultant, educational consultant. Talk a little about how those experiences have impacted where you are now.
You called me last, but I thought you asked Jason first.
No, I'm talking to you. You first. Yep.
Okay. Well, you know, just learning how to plan, right? Doing a lot of strategic planning. Again, one of the most crucial things in terms of organizations, or if you're siloed, is building your capacity, building a culture of success and impact, knowing people, because people are interesting, right? How do you manage personalities? How do you pivot, right? How are you putting the most that you can put into a person to build their capacity based on their needs, be it a young person or an adult, right? Because I do a leadership development, right? In terms of efficacy, knowing yourself as a leader, because everybody's needs are different, right? Sitting with yourself, you know? So these are some of the things, like I said, as a young person, I got so many skills from the Valley. There was a panel that we had with some young people that we taught when I was in my early 20s, who too are in their 40s, upper 40s. And before culturally responsive pedagogy became a thing with acronyms, we asked them, what is it that we did for you back then that you can reflect on now that led to your professional practice and who you are as an adult? And some of those conversations were profound. The first thing they said is, first of all, we knew that you all cared about us. You expected excellence. You taught us about our history and heritage in a way that we had never heard before. You made us connected to the community in ways that we never thought about before. And I actually have a former student on this call. She just back office me like, hey, Ms. Kareem. I'm like, hey, girl. But you never know where your past will pop up in your present, right? And this work is about, again, sustainable systems and a continuation of impacting of all things good and developing our institutions. Got that from the Valley? It's followed me in every sector of my next steps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jason, if you can talk a little bit about how Brotherhood Sister Soul has been able to sustain itself, and not only sustain itself, but expand and grow to some amazing and inspiring levels. It's been over 2.5 decades, correct? That's not an easy thing to do. Many of the organizations that we listed in the open of this discussion no longer exist, right? Many of them don't. You all have been able to sustain yourselves and grow. How?
Hard work.
What's the answer? What's the magic key there?
I think the real magic key, I kind of touched on this earlier, is building a community of folks who believe in the vision and who are willing to do the work to make sure that it survives. Over these 2.5 decades, that we've done this work, there have been times where, we could have closed. Not more than one, where the money was not there. And there were people who were willing to work without pay in order to make sure that we didn't close. So that's one thing, and that's real in terms of staff. And, I think of 2008, for example, when, the economic crisis hit, there were a lot of organizations that went under in those years. And, I think we could get into a whole conversation about the philanthropic world and the challenges and problems there. But through that process, I think we learned who were our real friends and who were those sometimes friends, right? Because we heard at one point, oh, your finances don't look so good, we're not going to give you a grant this year. It's like, oh, really? Okay, so when we most need it, you're not going to give it. But then we also had other people who stepped up, right? And who really stepped up to the plate. So I think one is the way in which we've cultivated our board and really, expanded, the number of people who have, the bottom line is the hardest thing in this work is the financial side, right? How do you sustain yourself financially? That's what we've found, right? Working with the kids, supporting our community, that's our passion, that's our expertise, that's what we do really well. Challenge is always, how do you sustain it financially over the course of time? And, through various administrations, we've gotten more or less support, from government. And sometimes we've had really strong allies, but, we've been through various administrations where we didn't have great allies. So that's been one piece of it. We have a lot of philanthropic from the foundation world, support, and that's been really key. But also, I think one of the things that, in the last, I'd say 10 years, that has been one of the keys to success is getting people on the board who have connections to wealth, who also believe in our vision. And I think that's the challenge, is that finding people who have connections to wealth, who also aren't going to try and change you, who see eye to eye with what you're trying to do, and who want to support you in that work and aren't trying to kind of push you into a different direction. And I think that's been one of the most powerful pieces of support that we've had to help sustain us financially through, the various challenges we faced, especially in our growth. And we've had a lot of growth just in the last 5 years with the new building that we just opened up and the expansion of our staff just in these last couple of years. So that's been key. And of course, government support. There's been a number of, we learned about the whole hiring a lobbyist, hiring a firm that works for you, that is lobbying on your behalf. That was critical in terms of gaining more government support. And I had always thought about lobbyists, for negative, in a negative way, but actually, there's a way in which you can, there are firms out there that support folks to do really good work. And that's been key for us as well, working with lobbyists to help us get more government funding too. You're muted, Lumumba.
We could have a lengthy discussion around the sustainability and the keys to sustainability for organizations in general, but particularly youth service agencies. But I think some of what you shared is extremely important. And I wanted to shift to Sarah, who's going to help us with some of the questions that have been put in the chat. And we're going to start fielding some of those questions.
Okay, so Joshua Laub was saying the pandemic has made many of the disparities in health, mental health, and education much worse. What areas would you like to see an expansion of youth services to meet the current needs of young people and their families? What would it look like?
Majida, can we to you and then go to Jason? Sorry.
I think one of the things is to create the why, right? And articulate that in a way of why it's so important and pivotal and critical for our communities. The last part of that question I didn't hear. So could you say the last part again?
Yeah, so they're, just asking with this expansion of youth services to meet these needs, like what would that look like? What would it look like for young people and their families?
I think we need to ask the young people and their families what they need. A lot of times there's a dictation of what the need is and not a conversation or question of what the need is, because different communities have different needs at different times. So I think that'd be a first foundational stepping stone.
And I hope my students are listening. I'm sorry, because when we talk about some of these principles of organizing, Majida is touching on some of them. So for my students that are in the chat, we're going to be lifting this up on Saturday. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
No, I think every time Majida, speaks, like I feel like I'm in one of those social, like those videos where it's just like, I'm like, are you listening to the jewels that are being dropped? But yes, what the irony of this is that our liberation program, the youth organizers in our organization, have made this their campaign. So they have been focusing for several years now on increasing the number of social workers, the number of guidance counselors, the number of college advisors in schools, primarily because of the mental health needs that young people have. And that's only been exacerbated, obviously, since COVID. But, the depression, the anxiety that young people, especially oppressed young people of color, poor young people have faced, that's been in our community forever, right? Like, we are suffering, and therefore our children are suffering. And so we need those kinds of supports within our schools, within our communities. And I think the number right now is one social worker for every 500 youth in the New York City public school system. So where do these young folks go or turn when they need mental health supports around issues that are, affecting their lives? And we all know that a student's success in school is in part dependent on how well they're dealing with all the other aspects and all the other things that are going on in their life that may be preventing them from really focusing on school and academics. So that's been their campaign for a while. They've just shifted, and they're not shifted the goal, but one of the things that they're deciding they want to fight for now is a wellness center in every school. And that would be a space that was non-academic within the school, where kids could go to just have a safe space and talk about things that are going on in their life and not have to deal with the stress of academics at that particular time. So exactly what Majida said, listen to the kids. They've been saying this for a long time. This is not new. It's not just since the pandemic, but it's only been exasperated, since the pandemic. And for those of you who don't know Joshua, get to know him. He's a fierce advocate for young folks in the education system for many, many years. Former principal, Banana Kelly High School, teacher at Eastside Community High School, great partner of ours for many, many years, and someone who our young people, when they're talking about organizing, they turn to Joshua just to get some information about how the DOE functions, and he's always been a great advisor to us.
Mhm.
Thank you. Joshua, such a great ally to have in that space. So Susan Wilcox, she was saying one of the greatest shifts I've seen in youth development in the last decade is a more nuanced and expansive understanding of gender. How is this reflected in your work?
That's a great.
Jason, then we'll pivot to Majida. We'll come around. Mhm.
Yeah, this has been, one of the questions that we get asked a lot because we do have gender-specific programming, right? So we do have brotherhoods and we do have sisterhoods. But the way in which we approach that is, one, those are the only programs that we run that are gender-specific, right? So we have many different all of our other programs are not gender-specific. So young folks of any gender expansive young folks in general can join any of our programming. And it's been a conversation that we've been having on staff. We have a lot of gender expansive young folks within our organization and even on our staff. And how do we think about a brotherhood, or how do we think about sisterhood within this, kind of new reality? It's a reality that's been with us always, but one that is, I think, more discussed and more open now. And so, the way we've looked at it essentially is that if you identify with being a brother, then you have access to the brotherhood. If you identify as being a sister or being a girl, then you have access to Sister Soul. And that we as an organization and as programs need to be welcoming of young folks and be teaching young folks about, the spectrum that gender is, right? And the social creation that gender is as well. So it's a conversation that we've been having for a while now within our organization, and we're working to find various ways to make sure that all the young folks who are along the spectrum in whatever form they take feel welcome and supported within our organization.
Mm-hmm. So that last part that Jason spoke to, and I think the larger question is, how do you create a safe and welcoming space for young people, right? No matter what you look like, no matter how you identify yourself, and respectfully doing so. I think that is the overarching foundational piece that needs to be dealt with. Safe spaces coming as you are, no matter how you identify, and to respect that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let
me just chime in also and say, I think that, developmental traditions will continue. Young people of other generations have always pushed the generation before them, right? This conversation around gender expansiveness, the binary around gender and sexuality, is something that I think these young folks are teaching us. And for us to recognize how we need to make sure that we're learning, right? Because there's a way that we can sort of say, well, if that's your thing, whatever, right? And be somewhat dismissive of it, as opposed to learning and being able to understand what this new reality. And for many of us, who are in our 50s, it is a new reality. It's like, okay, I'm learning. And for us to be okay with that. My daughter did a presentation a few years back where she likened this particular time frame to her grandparents who reintroduced themselves using African names and saying that this is how I identify. Like, I am rejecting this idea of Eurocentric norms. I'm rejecting this idea of all of this. And so I need you to respect my growth in this particular area. And it's very similar to what young people are demanding of us today. Very similar. This is our identity. This is how we want to be seen. This is how we want to be shaping the world, right? And we have this space where we have the opportunity to actually grow. And so I want to invite folks who do this work to really grow and learn from these young folks.
Thank you. So clear that with both of the organizations, it was, based on growing and learning from and with young people, youth adult partnerships, and it seems like kind of everybody is, still in that space.
Uh-oh.
The next person said, how do you think we should mitigate the impact of the digital age when it comes to exposing participants to travel? They seem to feel connected abstractly to the world, diminishing the desire to experience these places.
I think that as we transition out of COVID and we get more face-to-face and that human engagement, that pause that took place where the circumstance and the situation changes, they'll segue into that human touch, that human connection over time, right? Because there's a large level of comfortability with being online with myself as well, right? And I'm a full grown adult. So with time going back to what we consider to be, normal, that will take place. But then to excite them digitally about the possibility of that face-to-face, actually being in a space and a place to create incitement. I will always say, if anybody's boring when you knew them in person, they're going to be extra boring online. So once you go to this online orientation of, oh, we're going there, they'll want that face-to-face piece. So there's so many different ways. When you're creative with your pedagogy and how you teach, they will jump into the new space, face-to-face.
Yeah, I think we, there's multiple approaches. One is peer communication. So kids who went on the trip last year and had an amazing experience coming back and sharing their experience with other kids and showing the pictures and the good times and all that. So that helps to mitigate, in the sense of, wow, okay, that person did it. They had a great time. Now I think I might want to do it too. And part of it is also the kind of scaffolding of the experience, right? So every year we take kids just upstate or to Pennsylvania to retreats. We'll rent out a YMCA camp and they'll do overnights in a cabin, and we'll do hiking and canoeing. And, for a city kid, that's another world, right? So that's the first kind of experience. So then we'll do college tours, and we go every year on a college tour. So they'll go as far north as Boston or as far south as DC. So they're experiencing bite-sized experiences of other places that they, haven't traveled to before, haven't experienced before. So if you scaffold it, then, okay, well, now an international trip isn't so daunting as, it seems just off the bat. So those are a couple different ways. But, I think in terms of the digital age, that's a workshop in and of itself of like, how do you really address youth development in the digital age? Because, it's funny, I'm 50 years old now, and at times some of my staff, when I talk about, because I got into this because I love doing youth development, not because I love being a director of an organization. And they'll be, oh, well, back when you were doing it, kids didn't have cell phones, and that whole that whole debate about how it's so different now. And it is different now. And, the approach and how you address those issues. I mean, when we used to do international travel, kids didn't have cell phones. Now they're in Cuba and they're trying to, talk with their friend back in Harlem. And, we have to have rules in place so that, no, you're here, experience here, put the phone away. And, we've gotten, rules in place so that kids actually experience where they're at without feeling like they need to broadcast it. And that's the only way that it really is happening, right?
Yeah. Thank you. The next question from Bishop. I mean, I can imagine how you would answer based off of the commitments that you expressed in the first question, but she's just saying, what is your vision for community participatory research connected to current organizing priorities? Or do you guys already use kind of community-based participatory research as a way to surface the dreams, desires, et cetera, from the community?
You could take that, Jason.
Sure. So there's several ways in which that happens. One is, I talked about the campaign that the young people are doing around increasing the number of social workers and guidance counselors. Part of that initial phase of determining what campaign issue they were going to choose was a survey that they did within schools. What are the issues? What are the primary issues that young people are addressing right now? And that helped them to determine the focus of their campaign. So that's one way. Our environmental program, which also trains people to be environmental activists, is also going through the same thing of surveying the community, finding out what the needs are, and then determining within that what's the best direction for our organizing efforts. So for example, one of the projects they did was they turned the street in front of one of our offices into a public plaza. It's one of the few public plazas north of Central Park. And that was a community-based, they had to go get surveys, they had to lobby the community board, they had to apply to the city, a whole process of engaging the community. So there's lots of different ways in which we engage community in terms of finding out what the biggest needs are, and then trying to address those needs through our organizing and our activism. I don't know if that directly answers the question, or there's more nuance to it.
Yeah, I think so. Should I move on, or Majida, did you want to chime in, or should I go to Luz's question?
You should go to Luz's question, yeah.
Okay, so Luz was saying that she's in the capital region of New York State, and there's lots of respectability politics, lots of generic youth serving groups, but no support for Black liberation spaces. And she was just wondering if we could continue calls like this a few times a year to build with other groups and create a cross-state youth leadership. Anyway, we're open to it.
I think that's something that went on a lot in the 90s too, right? Mm-hmm. This interwoven connectivity between youth service agencies that would correspond often, flesh out ideas often, problem solve often. So I think Luz is spot on. And since we're talking about the 90s, I think I just said the 80s, to reuse those models, right? To reinvent, again, systems that worked, right? And have sustainability in regards to those that still exist. So, yeah.
And I we do take seriously as a youth studies program at a public university that we are here to create spaces for the public to come together and collectively strategize and think and dream. So, we should talk after this, but okay, so Jamila was saying, excellent discussion. Many mental health services focus on youth as individual and not part of a greater unit. How could we reinvigorate working with families as a crucial strategy in youth development?
Mm-hmm.
I think one crucial way is to approach superintendents who are over school districts, because our children are in schools, right? And to have conversations with them holistically, to approach them so they can be a greater impact on the schools in which they serve under their leadership. I think that's one way. The other thing too is creative curriculum building, right? Because you have whole class centers around this kind of social development and mental health issues. And it's rough being a young person, right? So the guidance counselors that we have in schools and the social workers we have in schools, anybody that's ever been a teacher in a classroom, they know that you've been all of that and then some. So how are you then preparing the teachers to take on these kind of micro roles and then to be connected to the community? Because if it's something that you cannot handle within the school system, to tap into organizations that could help to do the work so that we're working in unison, we're collaborating. And so there's some salvation songs going on as opposed to being afflicted what is happening with our young people. And that goes back to that community connection. So I say approach superintendents, talk to the school systems. Sometimes they don't know these organizations exist. You have principals and superintendents that are very community minded and connected, and some not so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add to that. I think for our organization, we have always been hyper-focused on the youth. And that means direct services to the young people. It means establishing relationships with the parents. But if I understand the question correctly, obviously parents need support as well, and supportive services as well. And that's a whole nother aspect of work, right? That as an organization, I definitely think we need to do more in terms of actually supporting the needs of parents. But I think, to Majida's point, connecting with organizations that do that work and having those kind of partnerships is another way to do it, because it's hard to try to do everything, right? And still do it well. And I think that's, so it's one of those things that we have constantly grappled with. And, the mission within our organization is every young person that comes into our organization, folks need to know the parents, have to have a relationship with the parents. But it's a whole nother level of then to say, well, what are all the needs of the parents and how are we supporting that? And that we haven't gone to that level in terms of our organization, but it's something that keeps coming up. And like, we know that broader need exists. And, we think about ways in which whenever issues arise, what are the organizations that we can partner with? We have something called the Grapevine, where it's like a listing of all the different organizations that provide support services to families. So we're always connecting people to stuff, but yeah, it's a great question. And obviously we need an intergenerational and a holistic approach to community development. And it's actually, I just wanted to throw out there the settlement houses. That was one of the things. Goddard Riverside, another one on the Upper West Side, is one of those that provided, crib to, grave, basically, support services, right, for all ages. And thinking about that model as another one that we should look at of, the holistic approach to how do we serve every kind of need that's within our community.
Mm-hmm. I want to add really quickly before you move to the next question. One of the most important lessons of the many that I learned at the Valley was that one of our valuable resources really was our ability to amass other community resources. The ability to be able to say, we don't do this, however, these folks over here do this. We don't do this, however, we can connect you with this. And I think that those were the things that made the Valley and other organizations that did it really powerful. So nobody walked away feeling like they had no answers, right? None of their needs met. And it was a really genuine way to respond to this, as opposed to trying to create something that's not in your wheelhouse, right? If you don't do, family mental health work, don't try to do it. Send them to someone who does that. That's their expertise, And so really encouraging, and I share this in my class, having a really comprehensive list of resources in your community and updated is totally not only essential, but extremely valuable, right? Because you will not be able to do everything. However, when you do youth work, you know that you will be introduced to a universe of needs that young people have, and you got to have some answers and or some direction.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have some other amazing questions. I just want to check in with time. Could we do one more?
Let's do one more. Yeah, and then we can close out.
So with the pandemic-driven shift to virtual hybrid formats, what do you see as the opportunities and obstacles virtual formats pose for youth organizing and activism models and the ability to connect back and impact community level change?
Go ahead, Majida. I see you.
Heavy load. I think that was a good question. I think that we need to use it to our advantage. Like I said, anytime you're climbing up a mountain and where there's another rock, you have to decide how you're going to pivot your body to get up that mountain, right? So towards that end, how are we going to use where we are based on what we have to have the biggest impact? And so many people are saying, I love hybrid because of X, Y, and the third, or I love you do a little bit of both, because whenever you're faced with a challenge, it'll be just that until you create a solution based on the need. So we just have to be creative.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, the pandemic forced us to move into this virtual world. There were people having Zoom meetings before the pandemic and organizing through this way before the pandemic. I think it forced us as an organization to develop another skill set, right? Develop another tool in our tool belt. All of our staff had to learn how to facilitate workshops, how to hold a meeting, how to hold a conference, all the things that we used to do in person, we had to move to a virtual level. We are now back to being majority in person, all of our programming, But what, obviously the internet does is allows us to connect with people who aren't able to be physically present. So there is a benefit right there to a broader reach, right, that you can have utilizing. I mean, I don't know where everybody's checking in, but I know Susan's in Hawaii, and we can all be jealous of her. She's probably sitting on a beach somewhere listening to this conversation. But the point is that it enables us to gather across all types of boundaries. So using it as a tool and learning ways to use it as a tool in our struggle is critical. Whether or not, I believe personally that you lose certain things when you go on this format, and you gain others. So it's just another tool that we need to learn to incorporate into all of our efforts.
Go ahead, Majida. I see you.
I just wanted to seek permission first, right? The other thing with the digital divide, though, is to fill in gaps, and it goes back to that conversation around resources, right? When we first started in the pandemic, remember, there were some students that did not have laptops or Wi-Fi even to engage in this new phenomena. So the thing is, if we want our students and young people to be successful, we need to give them the tools that will help to ensure their success. So that's another thing that just kind of came in my mind. This is something for Jamila. She says that she's noticed a lot of, and it wasn't a question, I'm sorry, it's a statement, it's anti-parent sentiment in social service spaces that is disappointing. This work is relationship building. I think that when you have social service agencies or community agencies that are in communities, one of the criteria for your existence is to hire people from the community, because they can tap into the community a way somebody else may not ever be able to, because you are my family. I know you, you watched me grow up. And then you build those relationships, just like, when you're a kid, you're going to go to the one that can get what you want out of mommy and daddy. It may not be you. So you're going to be strategic about how you go about soliciting your outcome. So I think part of the answer to that is to ensure that we are empowering our community. That also looks like employment, right? To make sure that is a face that is seen in some of these social service agencies. For you to get a contract, X, Y, and the third, we need to ensure that you're hiring people from the community to help to do this work. And that goes into the development stance as well, right?
Mm-hmm. All right.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, Sarah, for facilitating the question and answer portion of this. We're going to wrap up, but what I want to make sure that we walk away from this conversation with is understanding some of the contributions of the youth service work that existed, that allowed for the advancement of this field, that came out of a very particular time period that often is demonized, right? That often sometimes even forgot about, right? And that we, those who do this work, those who do it great, stand on the shoulders of those who stumbled to do it. Stand on the shoulders of those who made mistakes building this sort of platform, but it was done. And so by no means are we saying that it was perfect. In fact, it was not. The most amazing people will tell you, the list of mistakes that they made, right? And that is part of this idea of growth. That is part of this idea of building, is that we have to learn from our mistakes, but we have to get out here and do this. And so I want to thank Jason, Warwin, Majida, Abdul-Karim, I love you both. Thank you for taking time to participate in this discussion with me. Thank you all for joining in this discussion. And I hope that you take some of what was offered here, utilize what's useful, share if it's necessary, and hopefully it inspires you to dig deeper into your work. And hopefully we will come out of this space much better, more equipped, and more qualified to service these young people who deserve the very best of what we have to offer. Sarah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And just a plug, because we've been talking so much about kind of intergenerational partnerships driving community development work and driving the development in our city. Next week, we have an in-person session that's being facilitated by young people from the Intergenerational Change Initiative and the NYC Youth Agenda Coalition. There's going to be self-care and community care. So if you want a massage, some sound bath meditation, and then jump into real deep intergenerational dialogue about recommendations for our city that's based on youth generated data. Please, please, please join us next week. And just, I want to echo the tremendous gratitude for everybody that was with us tonight, Professor Bandele, and our amazing speakers, Majida and Jason. Thank you, thank you, thank you. See you next
Also
week.
wanted to say thank you, Molly and Joya as well
Oh,
for
Joya, oh my God, the whole events team, thank you, and
Yes.
Joya so much. Molly, Heather, everybody, thank you.
captioning team. Thank you so much. Absolutely. All right, everyone have a good evening.